I've been thinking lately about the iconic horror villains of cinema and the state that they're in a modern day film context. See, if I ask you to think of any, specifically if I ask the question, who is the most famous killer from the slasher genre, your mind surely shoots right to a character likely created in or around the 1980s. The obvious answers are always the big few in form of Halloween's Michael Myers, Friday the 13th's Jason Voorhees, or my personal favourite of this lot, A Nightmare on Elm Street's Freddy Krueger. There are of course also the surrounding obvious ones like the arguable original in Leatherface and a slightly more modern masked maniac in the various Ghostface killers of the Scream franchise. But even still, even Ghostface is as old as I am, having debuted nearly 26 years ago in 1996. That's not exactly a fresh take anymore. Scream may have revolutionized the idea of poking a bit of fun at the horror icons prior to its release, and Ghostface did just return to cinemas again. But this is still a case of nostalgia and continuing a legacy, and is still somewhat of a reincarnation of what came before. And look, I'm not complaining that Scream has returned in the slightest, but I am complaining about the lack of a fresh take in today's generation of horror movies. Today we lack what Ghostface represented upon the first Scream's release in the mid-90s, and that's an identity in horror. The problem is this generation of films has no horror icon of its own. So, how about if I ask you now who the biggest horror icon is in films that are coming out today? Okay, fine, Michael Myers is still kind of the answer here, but here's the exception to the rule. And much like Ghostface, this is still an example of a franchise's continued legacy many years after the original run. I desire new faces of the genre though. I've mentioned this on my channel before in some recent videos, like on my Saw series that I did last year, in which I considered Jigsaw as being a newer example of a horror icon, a character that is now proven to stand the test of time and is very much a part of the horror movie canon to fans today. Jigsaw is undoubtedly an important part of these icons and deserves to be there, but even Saw has become one of those legacy franchises on its own. It's more recent, but a film coming out from 2004 is still 17 years ago. Jigsaw is what's considered to be my generation's horror icon, as he played a big part in keeping my stupid idiot kid brain up at night for a time.
Can't sleep.
That fucking puppet thing from Saw.
Delete me. Can't sleep.
That fucking puppet thing from Saw.
But there just haven't been any examples that play nearly as strong a part since. The closest I can think of to a modern day horror icon like this is perhaps Annabelle, who even in the context of her own films isn't actually an autonomic being, but merely an object that's been possessed by something else. A conduit for evil, as they put it in those films. Apart from Annabelle, there's regrettably also The Nun, but I don't think she's here to stay since the 2018 movie pretty much bombed. I mean, at least critically. Unfortunately, I have to admit, I could be wrong, because it did not bomb financially at all. The Nun actually made bank, so maybe it will come back, but pretty much everybody hated that movie, so I'd be surprised. Apart from Annabelle and The Nun though, I really can't think of many more that could be considered even being close to a modern day horror icon. Candyman is one that just made a revival last year, but again, I'm not really counting it if it's a remake or reboot of earlier films from the 80s and 90s. This is the same story for Chucky at the moment, as well as Pennywise, and for any of the upcoming Chainsaw Massacre, Scream, Halloween, and or Saw/Spiral films. And by the way, despite my complaints, I do acknowledge and highly appreciate that fantastic original horror movies are coming out regularly now too. If anything, ever since 2016 or so, we've seen a great resurgence for our spooky little films. Jordan Peele, Ari Aster, David F. Sandberg, Mike Flanagan, Christopher Landon, Lee Winnell, James Wan, Robert Eggers, and many more are all examples of greatness coming out of today. But these are typically one and done stories, or at least even if they are part of a franchise, they tend to have different villains, like with James Wan's Insidious and The Conjuring movies, having different paranormal foes each time. Now, there's nothing wrong with these movies in the slightest, but we are lacking in terms of instantly recognizable rogues. That's all I'm saying. I'm more saying that our 2022 mindset has to change if we want to see anything like what I was describing before when it comes to Jason V and his big boy bro Mikey Myers. Part of the issue may also have to do with the fact that distribution has entirely changed. Netflix and streaming is the mainstream way to experience cinema, and horror isn't at the height of its popularity anymore. Trends come and go, and with superheroes reigning supreme at the moment, horror has taken a backseat over the last few decades, and it's really become more of a niche interest. There's your more mainstream sides to the genre, but the trend has moved completely from the slashing ways of its past. One killer hunting down a group of people grew tiresome for audiences over the years, as we saw with each entry and new sequel try to one-up themselves and escalate from film to film, climaxing with Jason going to space in 2001, and the two in him and Freddy facing each other off released in 2003. I've spoken about Freddy vs. Jason on the channel before, but the absolute beauty to that silly fucking film is that it wouldn't be made in the same context today. The film rides the lines between trying to be genuinely cool, all while being tongue-in-cheek and over the top, but knowingly as well. It's a completely wild ride, and if they made a film like that today, it wouldn't even try to take itself seriously, and I think that's kind of what would be missing from that sort of thing today. But audiences today, though, live in a different climate. The audiences of today don't typically buy into killers killing for no reason and masked goofballs slashing teens. The horror genre today is all about the paranormal and jump scares, or are all about the concept, politics, and metaphors in what's known to be as the elevated horror trend I alluded to before. As per those directors like Flanagan and Ari Aster, came films like Get Out, Hereditary, The Witch, The Babadook, and It Follows. Maybe part of the problem of a lack of slasher horror icons is that it's not even really a problem at all. Perhaps we have just moved on from the simpler times of 40 odd years ago when a guy wearing a hockey mask was enough, when somebody getting stabbed in the back and dropping to the floor was nightmare inducing enough. But now audiences have toughened to the on-screen violence and intense moments via sheer repetition. Maybe what killed slashers was slashers themselves. Much like the possible future for this superhero genre, I think 80s slashers began to become a little too overexposed, and what little mystery that was left began to disinterest people. Once you see the same thing one too many times, that scare factor just isn't there anymore. You know, you've kind of begun to figure out how the sausage is made at that point, and it kind of kills any shred of ambiguity and it takes the fun out of it. And perhaps in modern times, even beyond that, there's this possibility that an icon that's inherently marketable at all has the inability to be scary now anyway. Because with that comes brand recognition, and what's less scary than some sort of corporation trying to be hip and with the times? I mean, once something is clearly becoming a cash grab, it's kind of hard to be scary. And then by the end, that's kind of what a lot of those movies from the 80s unfortunately eventually became. Stepping stones to the next big thing. Another sequel leading into next year's. And I think that audiences demand more than that out of horror now. And I think that's why the elevated horror subgenre is flourishing. And of course, with all that being said, horror is making a comeback, with Fear Street blowing up when that came out, with the Child's Play TV show that did pretty well, and with fantastic original series like Midnight Mass, and even to an extent something like Squid Game. We're seeing a bit more of quality horror in terms of it seeping into the mainstream. Halloween Kills was one of the bigger movies of this past year, as was A Quiet Place 2. Two examples of large audiences showing keen interest in the genre. That kind of shit definitely gives me hope for seeing more greatness to come. The more eyes, the more potential for budget and scripts being read. I think that this is all a great sign for the horror genre overall, but not necessarily for mask killing icons themselves. I wonder how the trend will evolve from here. I hope we do get to see some more horror icons conjure up, but I do think that as long as great films keep getting made as they always are, that we're golden either way.